So, Gary, thank you so much for organising the WWEM Analytical Conference. I see you have three main themes for this year's event. So, I understand the first one will be microplastics analysis. So, from a member of the public's point of view, thanks to David Attenborough and others, we know that plastics are a massive problem. But it makes you wonder if, because plastics are so ubiquitous, is the analysis of microplastics, is that actually necessary, or is the problem just so large that we don't need to do microplastics analysis? And is that something that's addressed by the speakers, or is that a silly question?
Yeah, so that's an interesting opening question. So we've got a couple of speakers lined up for this meeting, but both have been they're UK-based speakers. So I think in general that it is important to try and quantify, so monitoring and analysis of these microplastic particles, purely in terms of that they're ending up in the whole water cycle, so that we're actually starting to see them not just out in the environment. So there's been lots of work on microplastics in open ocean, coastal, marine environments, but also we're starting to see them more in rivers. And because they're going into the water cycle, they're actually going into the treated water cycle. So we're starting to see them in wastewater, we're starting to see them in our own drinking water, so our water supply works as well. And so our two speakers that we've got lined up, our first one is Richard Cross, who's at the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and they've been looking at a number of different monitoring and tracing microplastics through the water cycle, but looking at it in terms of where are they appearing in the treated water, so in our water supply work, so in our drinking water, and also in our wastewater treatment works. And then our second speaker is Dr. Fay Cathero from where I'm based, the University of Portsmouth. And I think she wants to take her talk looking a bit more in terms of the potential impact on human health. So that comes back to your question about why do we need to measure these, because they're obviously going into the environment and they are there, but because they act as vectors, and some previous research has shown that other pollutants actually attach onto these small microplastic particles. We want to see, is there a potential impact on human health? So if they're getting through the treated water supply, are they getting into our drinking water? And then potentially, we're drinking water from the tap that's actually got microplastic particles in there. So that's the second talk. Okay. And to come back to your question in terms of why we want to look at plastics, it could be that potentially we might be able to monitor and analyze, see what kind of plastics they are, but we might not be able to actually recover or do anything with them. So it's to try and think about some kind of intervention. So how can we actually stop the microplastics getting into the aquatic environment? So we've seen all these the banning of single use, so it was carrier bags, now it's the banning of single-use plastics, and there's various countries around the world are now bringing in this banning of single-use plastics. So whether that will start to have an impact will be. So
analysis kind of drinking water and wastewater, you're hoping, or the speakers are hoping, that that's going to inform mitigation measures kind of further upstream, as it were.
Yeah, so we can see whether where are their inputs. So is it mainly going into wastewater treatment? So is it coming from us and then going to the wastewater treatment plants, or are there other inputs of microplastics as well?
Okay. And then I guess wastewater analysis will kind of lead into the next session, which is COVID in wastewater. I saw in the press that people were testing wastewater for COVID, and I didn't immediately figure out why they would do that, but presumably that gives you some insight, presumably early insight, into the way in which COVID is spreading. So is that what people are going to be talking about? And B, is it just COVID, or will they be talking about coronaviruses or other types of pathogens?
Yes, good question. So I think really what's happened and I think it's for all three of these COVID talks, is they're based around this idea that people have been analysing wastewater to try and get an idea of what's going on in kind of like the human environment. So there's this thing called wastewater-based epidemiology, which is WBE. So there's been a number of studies for quite a few years now where people have been analysing wastewater, looking at what's in the wastewater. So people have done studies on pharmaceuticals for this wastewater-based epidemiology. So you can get an idea on what kind of pharmaceuticals are being used in what locations, and amounts of pharmaceuticals that are being used. And so in all three of these talks, it's a kind of an extension of this wastewater-based epidemiology, but now starting to bring in, looking for COVID. So it's really as a kind of an early warning system, but just to get an idea of where these inputs are and where the most prevalent inputs or the highest cases of COVID may be. And so there's a number of different, we've got three talks lined up here with people looking, some using slightly different techniques, but all in terms of monitoring of COVID based on this wastewater-based epidemiology. So the first speaker that we have is Isabel Stanton, and she's from Centre of Ecology and Hydrology. And she's looking at trying to monitor the levels of COVID on a smaller scale. So looking at this in terms of monitoring from schools and prison wastewater. And again, this has come from previous work that they've done where they've been trying to track pharmaceuticals. So they've been trying to track antibiotics to look at antimicrobial resistance. So again, this is just a continuation of that, but trying to look for, now obviously very important, trying to look for COVID in terms of can we characterize the disease burden in the total population? So whereabouts is the largest inputs coming from? And so that's why we can then look at monitoring these in the wastewater treatment works. Another talk is from Zhuheng Yang. He's from Cranfield University. He's going to be using a slightly different technique in terms of trying to assess COVID. So he's using a biosensor. So this is a deployable paper-based biosensor. So it's been used before for different types of chemicals and pathogens, but they're now extending this program out and trying to use this as a kind of an early warning or source tracking for early warning of any increases in COVID. So any escalation of the current pandemic that we're in, and this is part of an ongoing surveillance program that they're involved with. So that's a kind of a low cost deployable one. The even talk of being able to use a mobile phone app. So if you do the test, you can then register the result straight away. The third talk is from James Hannon, who's from Thermo Fisher. So he's going to be talking about laboratory analysis, but also looking at other types of biomarkers. So again, a bit more in terms of that wastewater-based epidemiology. So can you use other biomarkers as well as trying to quantify for COVID? And as this is the analytical session, James is then also going to be talking about a bit more in terms of the analytical side and automation and laboratory techniques in his talk.
Do you know if, presumably with the trials that have been undertaken in investigating COVID in wastewater, if that's delivering early warnings and information that can inform COVID measures, are the government showing any interest in setting up something that's more widespread to help inform their activities?
Yes, I think they have. So there's a number of large surveillance programs underway. So there's COVID testing at all the wastewater treatment work. So I know where I am, that in Southern Water area, they're analysing samples there, both for the wastewater-based epidemiology, but also trying to track COVID. So I think you can link that in with the government and the number of positive cases. But when they start to look at particular areas, it might be that those areas might need more testing, particularly previous months when they were trying to set up, which areas need the most testing. When you had those different coloured of the hot spots before you've had all the testing came in. By using the epidemiology, you could then start to gauge which areas were under a threat from the increasing case numbers.
Okay, that sounds great. And then the last session I understand is on PFAS. And my confession is that a year ago, I probably didn't know what PFAS was, but I think I'm probably in a very large group of men who are married to women who are in love with Mark Ruffalo. So a little while ago, we watched the Dark Waters film. I don't know if you've seen it, but it was it's based on a lawyer who took on DuPont in the States. And that was the first time I'd come across PFAS. And since then, I was somewhat alarmed to discover that it's still present in non-stick pans, waterproof clothing, firefighting foams, and even food packaging. And even more alarming, there's thousands of the things. So yes. from an analytical problem, it must be an absolute nightmare. So I assume that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the presentations at the conference will address this analytical nightmare and hopefully tell us that it's actually not as difficult as you might think. Sure,
yeah. So again, we've got a number of talks lined up for here. So the PFAS, as you said, I mean, I was aware of it because I was working with some people that were doing some analysis on this a number of years ago, before it came, like I suppose, maybe behind COVID microplastics, and then probably PFAS is right up there now as one of the hot topics.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the number of chemicals. So the PFAS is per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And there's around 4,700 different chemicals in this range. So, and as you said, in terms of like frying pans, so they've got these unique water, heat, and grease repellent properties that seem to be omnipresent. They seem to appear absolutely everywhere. You know, with us using them, ending up in the water as well. But I suppose the key thing to get across here is the reason why is because there's now increasing evidence that of toxicity and potential adverse human health effects, which is obviously why we need to do more monitoring, find out where these are coming from, which are the key PFAS chemicals, but also in terms of what's the long-term impact on human health and also on ecosystems in the environment as well. So for this, we've got three different talks. The first one is by Ian Ross from Tetra Tech. So he's going to be looking at trying to get to grips with the understanding of the fate and transport of these compounds in the environment, which, as Ian will present, is a very complex and very complex and challenging issue. So he's going to be talking about these, and in terms of some transformation products as well. So how these can actually change in the environment.
I think that's going to be quite an important issue because you can regulate against specific forms or different PFAS chemicals, but then the problem is that if precursors are caused in the manufacture of products that aren't regulated, then you might find the problem appearing just the same, even though you've regulated against half a dozen of them. So they can, and the manufacturers, the danger, I would guess, is that the manufacturers can adjust their processes so they're not using or producing the versions of PFAS that are regulated, but that might mean that they actually produce some that are just as harmful and just as persistent.
Yes, it's the same with a large number of organic molecules, organic chemicals. It's the biotransformations that take place. So you're not quite sure if you change one or regulate one, it could be that it might just change in the environment. It could be when it goes through wastewater treatment works that they could change there, and you end up with different compounds appearing there that never actually went into the water. They actually transform when they're in the environment. So that's the first talk. And then again, because it's analytical based, we've got Geraint Williams from ALS, who's going to be hopefully trying to tackle this big problem that you mentioned before in terms of how do we actually go about doing the PFAS analysis in the lab, and what a challenge that is, because one of the challenges they face, as I mentioned, they're very ubiquitous, so they're everywhere in the environment. But when we need to make the measurements in the laboratory, we need to determine them at very low concentrations with very low detection limits. So that's one of the real challenges, is being able to quantify these at such low concentrations, even though they're probably ubiquitous everywhere and potentially contaminating our samples. And one of the other limitations that Geraint will highlight is the limited on the number of analytical standards that are available. So when we try to quantify these, if there's thousands of potential PFAS compounds, do we have analytical standards for them? So are we actually able to analyze them and quantify them? So he's going to be talking about some different approaches in terms of some different types of analytical techniques, which brings us on to our last talk, which is from Angelika Kupf, who is going to then be talking, and we mentioned this in terms of regulation, she's going to be talking as well about as analysis in terms of some regulatory processes as well. So how do we start going to regulate the use of these PFAS compounds, both in Europe and also in the US, and again highlighting what Garan has spoken about in the previous talk, again talking about the challenges, the analytical challenges in terms of being able to quantify these compounds, and looking in terms of automation, multiple samples being processed at the site, so trying to get a large throughput in the laboratory.
Okay, well, I mean, it's difficult to imagine 3 more topical issues to address. So and also with WWEM being virtual this year, it's going to be a lot easier for people, and also free for people to as long as they're pre-registered, to attend the event, and also to drop in and jump out of presentations, that catch their interest. But the other thing I wanted to say is that to anybody that's interested in coming, especially if they work in a laboratory, is that there's a virtual exhibition going along as well, and there will be analytical product and analytical service providers there, many of whom specialize in these types of issues. And so unusually for a lot of these types of events, all of the names of the people that are pre-registered will be made available to those that are pre-registered. So if they see somebody that they know might have an answer to a question that they have, or they'd like to network with them or arrange a meeting, then there's going to be, with the platform, there's going to be a vehicle that they can use to arrange those meetings. And from the exhibitors, the virtual exhibitors' point of view, they will have experts available, but the experts aren't going to sit there for 2 days wondering if anybody's going to ask them a question. So it's very important that people pre-arrange, can I come along and talk to you about, PFAS analysis or microplastics or even, something that's not mentioned in the conference. So it's going to be very interesting to see how it goes this year. Hopefully there'll be more international visitors, and hopefully because people can log in from the comfort of their own bedrooms, then there'll be more of them. But I think it's a fantastic program that you've put together. So thanks very much, and really looking forward to it.
So, good, excellent. So the last thing, so at the end of each of our individual topics, we've also designated some time for some discussion as well. So we're hoping with the platform, so not just myself and the speakers, but we might be able to take some discussion points or questions on board.
Yes.
We've set aside about 15 minutes at the end of each session to have a discussion. So we'll probably be looking, I think we spoke about maybe having some questions put forward by people that have pre-registered already.
Right.
So we might be able to, so we might not be able to actually have the people ask the questions, but if we might be able to have some pre-asked questions that we can put to the speakers of each session to try and generate a little bit more, rather than just them giving their presentation, maybe then a bit of discussion in terms of the way forward. What do we need to do? What do we need to do next to take those, for the 3 big challenges of those topics that we're looking at.
Yeah. And I guess that you're going to have to be pretty strict with the timings, because if people say only want to watch the PFAS section, if they log in and I don't know, COVID has run over, then it could get a bit messy. So if people don't get their questions in the dealt with in the question time, then there'll be opportunity for them to arrange virtual meetings with the presenters and anybody else then after that time.
Yes, I hope so. Hopefully we'll be able to accommodate that through the platform that we're going to be using.
Okay, that's great. Well, thanks so much for your time, Gary.
Thank you,
Really
Graham.
looking forward to it, and talk to you again soon.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you.
Okay, cheers.